8,500 U.S. troops are on heightened alert and could be deployed to Eastern Europe in a matter of days. The Pentagon calls the move precautionary. This comes as Russia continues to build up its presence on the border of Ukraine.
Joining us with more is Eliot Cohen. He is the Burke Chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eliot, thank you for joining us this afternoon. You know, Russia announced new military drills, including some with ballistic missiles, but the Kremlin is capable of much more than that. What are the secretive tactics that you think Moscow could use to not only attack Ukraine, but against anyone the Kremlin feels is threatening?
Well, Russia has, of course, quite a large arsenal. It's important to remember that the Russian defense budget is considerably less than a tenth that of the United States. So it's a formidable power, but it's not on the same scale as the United States. Cyber attacks, for sure, an outright conventional invasion of Ukraine, various kinds of subversive things designed to undermine the Ukrainian government. There's even been talk of, in order to deter the United States, positioning nuclear weapons in this hemisphere. But I think it's important to remember that for a number of these tactics, they can come back and bite the Russians as well. You know, the United States talks a lot about cyber attacks. We don't really talk that much prudently about what we can do to other countries. And I think the Russians would probably be well advised to be mindful of that. They have their own vulnerabilities. They're also vulnerable in terms of their sensitivity to casualties. If the Russians launched a massive conventional invasion of Ukraine, they could probably take a large chunk of the country, but they should also expect a lot of fighting, a lot of casualties. And it's not a society that's really prepared to take that.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that there are a lot of possible repercussions that Russia may not realize that it could face. Are you saying that Putin is aware of this, or is he not clear on all of the possible repercussions?
Well, it's very hard to tell what Putin is aware of and not aware of for a number of reasons. First, he's been in power for over 20 years. I think it's fair to say that he probably doesn't get a whole lot of bad news from his advisors. The Russian intelligence community doesn't work quite the way the American one does, where you're much more likely to get a certain amount of truth to power. I think he's aware that he's aging and that this may be his great moment to accomplish something that he very much desires, which is to bring back Ukraine really back into being a part of the Russian state. He has been very explicit that he does not think that Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent country. And that's also something that we need to bear in mind. And then finally, we also know from earlier in his career that this is a risk taker. And in fact, it's something that his KGB bosses long ago were a little bit concerned about, that his sense of danger isn't all that high. So it's entirely possible that he will stumble into something that a better advised leader of Russia might not be inclined to do.
Interesting. And Eliot, Russian President Putin, of course, is expected to speak with French President Emmanuel Macron in the coming days. What is NATO expecting from that conversation? And is this a precursor to those written answers that Moscow says it wants from the U.S. regarding its security demands?
Well, the demands that the Russians put forward were non-starters. I mean, the very fact that they made them public, that's not the way diplomacy is normally conducted. And for sure, when you put forth those kinds of demands, you usually leave yourself some wiggle room so there could be a negotiation. They didn't do that, which has made a lot of observers, myself included, think that they actually, in some ways, were not intended to be particularly serious. I think the objectives for these talks really come down to those two men, Putin and Macron. What Putin wants to do is to divide NATO. He's actually had rather little success in doing that. He's had some. The Germans, in particular, have been quite reluctant to come on board in terms of supporting Ukraine. And President Macron has always wanted to assert himself as the leading European statesman. That's easier to do with the retirement of Chancellor Angela Merkel. But at the end of the day, I don't think Emmanuel Macron really wants to see a divide between the United States and Europe. So this is about the egos of two powerful men, and about the desire of the Russian leader to divide the alliance that opposes him.
And Mr. Cohen, if you could just bring it back home for people who aren't necessarily always following sort of these international tensions that exist and have existed in many countries across the world for decades, why should Americans care about what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia?
So there are a number of reasons why this is very important. First, there's the precedent. Ukraine's an independent country. It's a large independent country, 40 million people. It is in Europe. For it to be simply attacked and dismembered, that is a terrible precedent for all kinds of countries around the world. And if a predatory power like Putin's Russia gets away with it, it's a precedent which will come back to hurt us. Secondly, this is about Europe. It's about the future of NATO, which is our most important alliance, which has been a pillar of our security. You know, the difficulty sometimes in international affairs is it's a world of second and third order effects. And that's why, say, in 1935, well before World War II, somebody like Winston Churchill was concerned about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And as he pointed out, it wasn't that a threat to Ethiopia was a direct threat to Great Britain, but it was very much a threat to the kind of world that Britain wanted to see in the interwar period. And of course, we know where that led. It's always easy to say, well, this is a faraway country of which we know nothing. But that's what Neville Chamberlain said at Munich in 1938, and we know what followed from that.
There are repercussions for sure.
Always.
Eliot Cohen, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome.